The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
What I want to talk about today, then, are some of the forms of inadequate discourse that have inadequate perspectives and frameworks that have surrounded our discussion of television. The readings that I asked you to do for this week are early versions of that what I call the Wasteland Discourse. The fact is that although as I suggested in a message to you, that discourse has become a little less virulent in recent years for a lot of reasons, and I'm going to suggest one of the most ironic of reasons in a moment. Well, in fact, I'll do it now rather than sound mysterious. Finally, in a grudging and inadequate way, the American society and the cultural authorities in American society are beginning reluctantly to acknowledge that there might be some interesting stuff on television, that television might not be a completely contemptible medium. Even though the discourse that television is dangerous and bears poisons and can rot your mind remains significant. It's still around, and you can find evidence of it all the time. The professional organizations in the United States, teachers' organizations, medical professionals of various kinds, the eye doctors and the psychiatrists regularly offer denunciations of television. And in fact, I just on television today, I noticed the First Lady was suggesting that we need to protect our children from these horrific images on television by keeping them away from it. And the implication, I mean, I don't think she was being completely foolish about it, but that discourse that our children are endangered and threatened by the medium has a long and undistinguished history. The examples I've asked you to look at come from a relatively earlier phase, but they're useful to us because they're so systematic and clear. In different ways, they are embodiments of what I want to call the Wasteland Mythology. And I'm using the term mythology not in its anthropological, its respectable and marvelous anthropological sense, in the sense that a culture's stories are its mythology, but in the narrower popular sense of the word myth as a form of lie, as a distortion, right? And when I speak of the Wasteland Mythology, what I'm talking about then are a series of distortions or simplifying perspectives that have, for the most part, governed our understanding of television, and not just governed the popular understanding of television, that would be bad enough, but have also governed what we might call the learned understanding of television, have really undergirded in many ways, underwritten what were thought to be objective, of course they weren't, research programs, especially by social scientists who were the first academics to study television and got millions and millions of dollars worth of grant money from a variety of sources, even including the television industry itself, in order to try to study things like the effects of violence on television. And one culminating instance of that behaviorist tradition of research is George Gerbner's Annenberg's project. And I had you read that essay in part because it's a popular version by Gerbner of a popular representation of his research, and it's still, despite the fact that it's now its limitations are more widely acknowledged and understood, and there are a number of many younger scholars of the media generally and of television in particular are free of the limiting assumptions that Gerbner makes. It's still the case that the Gerbner research shows up in the paper, in the pages of the newspaper all the time, and you regularly get statements on over the public media especially from politicians and from policymakers that take for granted that the perspectives embedded in Gerbner's argument and Gerbner's research still hold. So we're not talking about something a myth, a pernicious myth that is now gone. It still has a hold on our culture, even though it's a less powerful hold, and it has been more systematically challenged in recent years than ever before. So we might think of the Gerbner article about the effects of violence on viewers and his studies of heavy viewers, light viewers, and so forth as an example of the learned discourse that embodies the aspects of the Wasteland Mythology. And we might think of Paul Klein's brief essay as a as a popular, as a version of the Wasteland mythology that's particularly pernicious because it is articulated by a person who is a media practitioner. He's part of the media elite, right? He's an advertising man, and he works in the media. And in fact, his attitudes are very widely shared, were very widely shared, even by the people who made television. I remember in the early days, in my early days as a television scholar, when I went out to Hollywood to do some first-hand research, I interviewed a number of TV producers and writers. And among the TV producers and writers that I most admired and that I thought were most interesting was a creative pair of creators, producer, writers named Levinson and Link. Some of you may have heard of them. What's their most famous program? Well, their greatest achievement on television is Columbo. They're the creators of Columbo. They were also the creators of a number of other very successful primetime programs. And Columbo was on the air, had been on the air for a couple of years when I went to Hollywood to meet Levinson. And Levinson had read my essay on television melodrama and initiated a conversation with me by writing a letter to me saying, that's all very well that you say that television melodrama is interesting, but what about this? And he attacked the medium. And so I went to see him when I went out to Hollywood. And it turned out that Levinson, like his partner Link, was embarrassed by his television work. He longed to be the author of plays. And he and Link actually wrote plays together, some of which were actually produced. They were never successful playwrights, but he was much prouder of his plays than he was of his television programs, even though the television programs he created not only reached millions upon millions of people, but were also, once you take a step back and look at them closely, artistic achievements of a genuine order. They weren't the highest form of art, but they were artistic achievements. And Columbo is a genuine contribution to the mythology of the American detective, itself a distinguished literary tradition going back to the beginnings of the 1920s at least. And the television detective as a category has a rightful and a respectable place in that progression from books to movies to radio to television. And Levinson and Link had made a genuine and important contribution to that discourse. They really are American artists of some genuine distinction, but they had no idea which of their achievements was valuable and worthy, because they themselves were the victims of what I've been calling an aspect of the Wasteland mythology. So Paul Klein's discourse about the least objectionable programming is a version of is a kind of media version of this sort of form of condescension to what mass media is or are, and what television in particular is. That constitutes another strand of the discourse. Where does the term wasteland come from? It's in many ways a very unfortunate, although immensely famous and widely known term. In 1961, what is that banging noise? In 1961, at a meeting of the National Association of American Broadcasters, President Kennedy's newly appointed head of the Federal Communications Commission gave a speech. And in that speech, he attacked television. He said, what is television? Look at television. Aren't you ashamed, you broadcasters? Because all television is a vast wasteland. And in fact, in 1961, if you actually look at television programming, look in the back of your books and march and see what was on television, what you'll discover, in fact, is that it was not a wasteland at all. It was not a field of Shakespearean genius, but it was certainly a territory of popular art and popular representation that had some very interesting material on it. But at the time, it was hard to recognize this. The only people who really recognized it, I think, were the millions and millions of Americans who sat happily before their television sets every night and watched the medium. Yeah. He was the head of he was Kennedy's newly appointed head of the Federal Communications Commission. His name was Newton Minow. And he coined the phrase, the vast wasteland. And the phrase has resonated ever since. And it became the label. Television was not a medium, it was a wasteland. It was a desert, and a disgusting desert, a polluted desert, right? That's where the term comes from. And it seems to me that one way of talking about what I mean by the wasteland mythology is to divide it into 4 subcategories, and we can think of them as 4 separate myths, strands of the mythology that taken together, working together, help to create a barrier between us and a true understanding of what television is. And remember, I'm not suggesting that the mythology is as powerful or as monolithic today as it was 15 years ago. But it's still present, and you can all recognize its presence in the public discourse that you'll find when the PTA rails against television, or when you see letters in your local newspapers about the evils of television watching, or when your eye doctor tells you to be careful about restricting your children's access to television. They're indulging in aspects of the Wasteland mythology. So the mythology is weakened, and there's an irony connected to its weakening that I'll come to in a moment. I started this and then I backed away from saying it. Maybe I shouldn't back away twice. The irony is that the irony has to do with the historical position of television. What's going on now that is helping to break down the Wasteland mythology? Why is it somewhat, remember, I'm repeating the question I asked before but didn't let you answer. Why is it that television programs today seem a little more respectable, that aspects of our culture are beginning to say, well, in a grudging way anyway, maybe television's okay, maybe there's certain programs that are good. There are now museums of television, there are television awards given out, there is a hall of fame of television, right? We're beginning to, what does that suggest? Yes?
Well, kind of that it's reached a point in its history and its maturation where people are embracing it as an art form that has something potentially to
That's
say.
right. I mean, in a way, that's right. But
also, well, does it have to do with
that?
the new technology that is starting to surpass it, and that we now have
that's really it.
the internet?
Yes,
and
there was the irony. The irony is, in a way, that we recognize the value of a popular art form almost always only at the moment when the popular art form has become an anthropological specimen. It's no longer a live form. Exactly this happened with the movies. I'll turn to this in a more, I hope, systematic and eloquent way in a moment. But the irony is that we're beginning reluctantly to recognize that the legacy of 50 years of television is not completely crap, and that in fact there are certain programs that are really worth preserving, not just because they're interesting cultural artifacts, but because they are instructive in the way that artworks are instructive, because they show wonderful performances and intelligent writing, and they envision the world in ways that are worth paying attention to. We're beginning to recognize that, at least about selected programs. We're starting to treasure these things, but we're starting to treasure them just at the moment when the medium of television is being so transformed that these kinds of programs are themselves artifacts, historical specimens.
can I just ask a question in relation to that?
Sorry.
Is part of the reason that discourse starts at that moment because when we are addressing the issues of the
In a way, yes. I think that's a very smart way of putting it. That one explanation has to do with the fact when a new medium comes in, it creates an environment in which certain things that you've taken for granted about ancestor systems are now brought to the surface, made visible. You become aware of them. And one of the ways we can feel that in our own society right now is all the discourse about the history of the book and about the book as a technology. Right? There's a whole new discipline that has emerged in the last 25 years called the history of the book. Well, why would that happen? The book's been around. Wasn't there a history of the book at the beginning of the 20th century? The book had been around for hundreds of years. It's partly this sense that the book is being displaced, that it's threatened, that it almost as if it's an item in a museum that is no longer. I think books will never become simply museum items. That it's a mistake to think that the new technologies will obliterate the functionality of books. They've lasted as long as they have because they serve fundamental human needs, and that can't be replicated by the new technologies, and won't be. There are certain things that books do that can be done better by the new technologies, and those functions will be taken over by them. For example, certain forms of archiving, certain forms of listing, right? Certain dictionaries, right? Certain kinds of research materials are much more effectively done in hypertextual formats than in book forms. How much easier to look in an electronic dictionary in some ways than to look in a dictionary that you turn by hand. Although there are certain losses about that too, because there's a serendipitous discovery you make when you go through the pages. So maybe that even that dictionaries themselves as book technologies won't completely disappear. But yes, I think that's exactly right. That one reason is, and our nostalgia about the book is a very dramatic instance of that. And what I'm suggesting is that our nostalgia about 50s or 60s television is in part an instance of that as well. There are other explanations too, but part of it is simply that, you know, the materials are already fading into history. They're no longer a part of the dailiness of our lives. And exactly the same kind of thing happened with movies. Someone else had to push your microphone on.
I don't know if you would agree with this or not, but one other sort of explanation I've heard is the advent of video games gave people another scapegoat. So sort of television became okay because they had another target that they could say is sort of the greater evil. So television becomes.
I think that's very relevant. Although I wouldn't limit it to video games. That is to say that there's a larger phenomenon involved. Video games are a part of it. New technologies always incite a discourse of disgust and fear. And when television was the new technology, that's what happened. And in fact, when the movies were a new technology, the movies generated a discourse that was almost identical to the discourse that then began to be devoted to television. When television emerged in American society, it was dangerous for children. Its violence was damaging to the larger culture. It encouraged certain forms of immorality. The really eerie thing about this progression is that one can see the same kind of discourse attached to books in the 18th century, to theater in the 16th century. One way of understanding this problem is to recognize that one of the functions of new media may very well be in a cultural sense to be a scapegoat, to be a kind of lightning rod for the fears and terrors of the society in some sense. Juvenile delinquency is a much more difficult and complicated problem than the problem of complaining about the representation of juvenile delinquents on television, right? Solving the problem of violence in our society, especially disarming our incredibly bloody society, is a much more complicated and intractable social and political problem than railing, as Holy Joe Lieberman does, against the representations of violence in movies and television, right? So I think that's what's at issue, and you're exactly right. Video games are a part of these new digital technologies that are emerging, and some of the fear and anxiety that used to be attached to television is now being attached to these things. And as that happens, television, in an ironic way, becomes more respectable. So that's a partial explanation as well. Yes.
I also think I also think the advent of the cable system allows for more niche programming that are of more substantive value and educational. Like now you have 24-hour cable news that you didn't have in the 50s.
Well, the advent of cable is a very important phenomenon, and the breakdown of the network monopoly is the transforming fact about television, even more than the new technologies. The transformation of television from a television of consensus to a television of multiple voices is one of the stories we're going to track in this course. But it's a little more complicated than the way you formulate it, because it isn't necessarily the case that there isn't some loss involved as well as gain when the medium changes from being a consensus medium to being a medium of plural voices. But I'm getting ahead of my argument. But we're going to look at that problem very closely and systematically before we're finished in the course. And one of the things I hope we'll be able to do before the course is over is actually by looking at a program, even if you don't know when it was. No, you don't know what the dates are. I'll be able to show you a program, and you'll be able to tell by particular features it has, not just technical features, formal features, but also by its content, what era it belongs to. And once you get to that point, you have achieved the capacity to read thickly, right? To achieve a kind of thick description of television. And some of that capacity to sort of recognize, it involves a capacity to recognize what we might think of as the moral or political, the ideological implications of the text of the program you're looking at. And those ideological values are deeply connected to television's role, first as a consensus medium, and then later when that consensus function begins to break down. The consensus function isn't totally gone, but it's becoming residual. It's minor now, and there are a lot of ways we can see that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It's as if you guys are too smart for me, so you won't let me be systematic. But I expect to take these questions up in a more systematic way as we proceed. Yes? Hit your microphone. Yes?
Television can now be viewed as benign because you have historical evidence to show that there's a generation that's out there that's been running the country, that has been functioning as human beings in the workforce, and they are okay.
That's
I mean,
incredible.
and so as a result,
You know,
there is...
maybe I don't have to give these lectures because, I mean, of course, you're anticipating a central point I was about to make. One of the myths that, in the strand of mythology, one that I would separate out. I mean, remember, the mythology is a whole, right? But it can be subdivided into various strands or substrains, some of which are argued by some groups and some of which by other groups. One of the most powerful and central is what I call the myth of the narcotized audience. This is the myth that suggests that's embedded in a certain way in Gerbner's research, right? Or the heavy viewers look at the world as if it is much more dangerous than light viewers. Therefore, television turns people into paranoid stay-at-homes. Television turns people into folks who imagine the society is far more violent than it is. Right? That's just one instance of this narcotic. And in fact, I don't use the imagery of narcotics lightly. In fact, there's a lot of the discourse about the effects, the baleful effects of television on the population, utilizes what we might call a medicinal vocabulary. It talks about television as a form of poison or a form of narcotic or a form of hypnosis, right? And the strongest argument against it is the argument you've just made, isn't it? Because in fact, more than a generation of people have grown up watching television. The society is not more violent than it was 30 years ago or 40 years ago. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that we're less violent now, that less murder is being committed now than 50 years ago. That statistic in itself suggests that there's a problem. And in fact, you know, the audience that was supposedly grew up on television, never had any technology in their lives apart from television, did not grow up to be mindless idiots and completely manipulated and controlled by the medium. And the other piece that I asked you to read is the most egregious of these arguments. And one reason I wanted you to see it is I don't know how many of you know who Jerzy Kosinski is, but Jerzy Kosinski was a much admired, it turns out he's a fraud in all kinds of ways. Even his novels were frauds. But he wrote books that purported to be autobiographical about his escape from the Holocaust. And it turns out they were all lies. I mean, he was a really contemptible creature, much admired through the 50s and 60s as a great artist. He was really himself a fraud. But what's interesting about his piece is the contempt he shows for people and for the medium of television. The ease with which he believes the medium can manipulate them and can control them. His evidence is ridiculous. It's not persuasive at all. But the contempt he's showing for people and his sense that the medium is this incredibly powerful, mesmerizing force is an instance of what I mean when I talk about the myth of the narcotized audience. And you're exactly right. The strongest argument against it is the evidence that generations have grown up without being damaged. But let's be a little more specific about it. What's wrong with George Gerbner's logic? What's wrong with the idea? I mean, remember what he did. And he gives you even the tables. He said, okay, he asked people, how many of you watch television 5 hours a day or 7 hours a day or 8 hours a day? Those people who watch television in the category that he designates as heavy viewers, you know, in answer to questions, said things like there was more violence in the streets than the light viewers said. They believed in general that the world was a more dangerous place. And then Gerbner concludes, well, people who watch a lot of television are turned into paranoids. They believe that, television is such the representations of violence on television warp the mind, distort one's sense of reality. What's wrong with the argument? Why is the argument ridiculous?
Well, I have to say that I had a very complicated reaction to this piece and to all the pieces we read because I don't feel unilaterally that everything they're saying is ridiculous. This is my first exposure really to television theory, and I'm sure we'll be talking out the various arguments they put forward. So in terms of the entire framing argument, I'm not sure that some of it is valid. Some of it, I'm not sure about it. But in terms of methodology, the very specific question you just asked, my reaction to that was that at least currently, socioeconomic status is often correlated to television watching. At least that's what I believe. We are told that children who live in dangerous neighborhoods, whose parents have to work all day, are more likely to be plopped in front of television for a longer time during the day. Therefore, that would seem to suggest that people who were watching TV more often really did live in more dangerous streets.
All right, that's very good. I think that's a part of the answer. That's one defect in his perspective, but I think there's a more obvious one. And that once it dawns on you, realize, I mean, he's making he's making an assumption about cause and effect, right? He's saying people who watch a lot of television think the world is more violent. But isn't it just as likely that people who think the world is violent will stay home and watch television? If they're afraid to go out, they're going to stay home. There's no reason to assume that, and there's no way he can suggest, and in fact, if we think about, the people who are shy, people who are reluctant to encounter the world, are also more likely to be fearful people. There's no reason, and in fact, it turns out that there actually have been studies by skeptical folks who found ways of asking similar kinds of questions of populations in which television was not a factor, and what they found was in effect confirmation of what I'm suggesting, that the notion that television is the cause of the fearfulness or timidity of the viewer is something he simply takes for granted, but he has no grounds for justifying. And there's something else. It has to do with what the assumption about the audience is. And this is an area in which there really has been a lot of interesting, liberating work done in the last 15 years or so. One of the other assumptions that's at the heart of the Wasteland mythology in general, and especially the myth of the narcotized audience, is the notion that the message that comes from the medium is very monolithic and simple and easy to absorb. It's a method, so that the message itself is simplified. The message means only one thing, right? Whereas if we look closely at the message, we might see that it's actually a complicated message, that it can be interpreted in many ways by different people, right? And the second thing it simplifies is the recipient of the message. It assumes that everyone who receives the message not only receives the same message, but never changes in his or her capacity to understand the message. In other words, you don't even get better at or more skeptical. In other words, the audience, it's not just a monolithic audience, which is ridiculous on the face of it. It's also an audience that never learns, that never improves, that never gets better at watching. Right? There's an incredible simplification of what the audience is. It's a model for what we might call it's a model for the reception of the television message that simply won't hold up. And in fact, in the last 15 years and more, there has been an elaborate series of studies, some of them ethnographic in origins, partly sort of anthropological, but applied to contemporary urban societies, in which particular subcultures are looked at closely, and what, of course, as you might guess, different subcultures watch television in very different ways. It isn't just the fact that children watch differently from adults, but different social classes not only have different preferences about what programs they watch, but interpret the programs they watch. They both watch at the same time in different ways. The audience is not a simple passive recipient of the message, but is an active participant in the making of the meaning that the message has. The notion that the audience is passive and incompetent is impossible to demonstrate. And one of the most interesting early books of this sort is one that I've cited on your sheet. It's called The Lively Audience. And it's a study of children watching television. And one of the things this person did when she watched, there's been a lot of work since then, but it's one of my favorite such studies, because what she did was she watched people in the environment of the medium, and children. And what she found is that children almost never watch television in a kind of monolithic way. That in fact they're often engaged in what we would call multitasking. They have dolls or books or coloring books or homework or musical items next to them. They might be watching next to friends. They don't pay continuous attention to what they see. They don't sit still when they're watching. Right? They're a lively audience. And as soon as you begin to recognize that in fact the conditions of reception will vary for particular subcultures, particular groups, particular individuals, you begin to realize that the monolithic assumptions, that what I'll call broadly the behaviorist model for understanding television viewing is a ridiculously inadequate one that insults the audience. So one of the things that's wrong with the Wasteland mythology and with its notion that the audience is manipulated, narcotized, mesmerized, controlled by what it watches, is that it radically simplifies and underestimates the complexity of the interaction between the viewer and the medium. It doesn't recognize that viewers can learn and become more sophisticated as they watch. It doesn't recognize that viewers can watch selectively and filter out what they don't like and accept what they do like. And in fact, there's an awful lot of recent work on media reception, on what's sometimes called reader response or reception theory, suggests exactly this. Some of it's very exciting and weird and strange. Aborigine groups are shown television, have been shown television, and one of the most exciting and weird examples of this is that some researchers interviewed folks who from in so-called underdeveloped areas, third world countries, interviewed them with regard to their response to the Rambo movies, and they transformed Rambo into a kind of rebel leader who was on the side of the Aborigines and on the side of the oppressed underclass, and he became a kind of Robin Hood figure or a liberationist hero to these people. Now, one could say that's a radical misreading of the Rambo films but what does that mean to say radical misreading? The reader's own creativity and the reader's own impulse to filter out certain data and to read certain data in a certain way is an inevitable aspect of the process of watching television, of watching any media text. And the early the Wasteland Mythology doesn't acknowledge that, and all behaviorist accounts of television don't acknowledge that. And to this very day, when they talk about the baleful effects of television, the journalists and popularizers and politicians who believe in this principle are believing in a body of research that has really been largely discredited, in part by the advent of what I'm calling reception theory, by the recognition that the process of reading the text, the process of seeing the text, is much more complicated than simply a simple message coming into the brain. The other side of the equation, the message itself, is equally complicated. And one of the problems with the Wasteland Mythology is that it has a very unproblematic attitude toward the message. It doesn't recognize that the message is, as some of the television theorists say, is polysemic. That it's multiform. It can be read in many ways. That there's a surplus of signification in most television stories, in most television representations, and there are going to be ways to read the text, to respond to the text, to encounter the text that are not single but multiple. And there's overwhelming evidence, for example, that ghetto audiences understand and read television in ways radically different from the way white middle-class audiences do. Suburban audiences read television differently from the way urban audiences read television. Sometimes what we might think of as the distortions or the creative misreadings are very dramatic, so that the cops are turned into villains in cop shows by certain minority groups that feel themselves to be oppressed by cops. And the criminals are regarded as more heroic figures, even though the basic substance of the plot and the story might want to argue otherwise. But there are readers who say, "Wait a minute! I'm going to turn this story. I'm going to use this notion that viewers are creative and interpret materials in ways that are useful to them is at the heart of this new way of thinking about what television viewing is." So the message is going to carry implications and possibilities that will be seized upon by different audiences in different ways. And that's another reason why the Wasteland Mythology, which has a monolithic view both of the message and of the person receiving the message, is inadequate. One aspect of that, of what I've been talking about, is what I've called the myth of commercial tyranny. And I haven't touched on this yet, and I want to say a word about that before we finish. The myth of high culture, the notion that high culture items like novels and plays and poems are inherently superior to the mass culture items like television programs, is something we'll talk about in a little while, in a subsequent class when we talk about the specific subset of the myth of high culture that organizes the historical understanding of television even to this day, which is the myth of the golden age of live television. And in our next few classes, after we've had a chance to look at some early television, we'll take this up in a systematic way. The notion is that in this moment when there was live theater on television, or the equivalent of live theater, television was in a golden age that it lost the minute film became the dominant television medium for television fiction, and the minute that a powerfully influenced advertising energy took over the production of television programs. The implication is not just that the golden age of live television was golden because it was theatrical, but also because it was believed to be freer of commercial intervention. Both of these are aspects of the myth are mistaken, and we'll talk about why. But this is a topic for a bit later on, after you've had a chance to look at some golden age, so-called golden age theater pieces, and we can compare them to other kinds of things. But let me say a word about the myth of commercial tyranny. This is the idea that because a tech, and in a way, the Paul Klein piece is an embodiment of that, right? In other words, okay, advertisers support the program has to reach the largest number of people possible, therefore there's the LOP theory, the least objectionable programming theory. That's another version of it is the lowest common denominator theory, right? In other words, the reason television can't be any good, it was a version of an argument that had been made about movies before television, is that it's such a mass medium, it has to reach so many people, it has to please so many folks, that it has to be geared to the level of an 8-year-old. It can't offend anyone, so therefore it's no good, right? Well, what's wrong with that argument? There are a couple of things. The most profound and central thing that maybe what I should do is read here, because I can make more progress this way, and I'll end with this. Let me parenthetically say the myth of historical discontinuity, it's beginning to break down now, but it's still there in one sense. There's this notion that television can't be compared to any other ancestors, that it's not like books, not like movies, that it's sui generis, that it's a unique phenomenon. This is a problem that occurs whenever a new medium enters society. It's not seen in historical terms. It's not understood in relation to ancestors. And that means that so what that does is it cuts us off from the recognition that some of the responses one has to television are also responses that earlier cultures might have had to other media. In other words, it cuts us off from comparative media studies, which we need to do if we're going to understand what television is. And I think that myth is breaking down now. There is a significant amount of historical work being done. But let me conclude by saying a few words today about the myth of commercial tyranny. We can call it in a way a kind of unexamined assumption about the nature of the medium, right? Partly because its invasion and conquest of America was so swift and occurred in a period of disorienting turbulence in every sphere of life. Remember, television emerges right after the Second World War, during a period of astonishing social transformation. It's the period when the suburbs appear, right? And in fact, there's an intimate connection between the suburbs and the growth of television. We're going to look at some episodes of television sitcoms that actually dramatize this process for us. The culture, it was the period of what we might call the consumer revolution. It was also the moment. Television is born in the moment when toasters and washing machines and refrigerators and electric ovens and an immense range of household items became available to middle class and lower middle class Americans for the first time. What happened was there was this pent-up energy that was a function of that had been devoted to the war effort. There was this pent-up manufacturing energy that was sort of waiting to explode. And after the war was over, after the Second World War was over, the nation's manufacturing genius returned to peacetime effects. So that's a part of what was happening there. So partly because of that, television was almost always perceived in its aspect of of discontinuity. It began in a moment of social turbulence that encouraged the notion of historical discontinuity. But let me now turn to the myth of commercial tyranny. We can see Paul Klein as an instance of that, a kind of cynical version of the myth of commercial tyranny. In that myth, in that article, he talks about his LOP theory, the notion that in their desire to reach the widest possible audience, network moguls will always strive for the least objectionable programming. Well, central to this argument, as well as to all other myths, all other versions of the myth of commercial tyranny, is the idea that the desire to reach a large audience is, by its nature, ipso facto, an evil desire. This is the unifying principle, alas, of Barnow's 3-volume History of American Broadcasting, of which you're reading the 1-volume redaction. In other words, where Barnow is not adequate is on the content of programming. He's still helpful on the economic history of broadcasting, but he believes this. He thinks that television is bad because it wants to reach a mass audience. Right? In all of his books, and especially in Tube of Plenty, Barnow takes for granted that commercial ambitions are incompatible with responsible journalism or with artistic ambitions. But why should we accept this? Think about it for a moment. Shakespeare and his contemporaries in the theater were popular entertainers, ambitious for wealth, committed to speaking to their public in a consensus voice. It was commonplace in the Elizabethan theater for the owners and managers of the repertory companies to pay 5 and 10 times as much for costumes as for scripts, which were often passed on to several writers for improvement along lines set forth not by other writers, but by entrepreneurs concerned only for the box office. And we can make the same argument about novels. Some of the greatest novelists of the 18th and 19th centuries were similarly committed to a public and a consensus art. Dickens is a wonderful instance of this, a man who, one of the most popular novelists of the 19th century, a man who in his own day was exploiting the new technologies of book distribution and book publication to reach the widest audience that had ever been reached by storytellers before. And he came under attack as a popularizer, as a simplifier, in his own day and even afterwards. The economic and commercial pressures that undoubtedly shape American television need to be studied suspiciously and closely. And suspiciously, really suspiciously. But we need to study them in a rational spirit that begins in the recognition that art and other forms of communication are always embedded in the commercial and technical systems of their societies. There is no media form that isn't in some sense shaped by, controlled by, formed by the commercial and economic necessities of its culture. And one could say this is a version of the discontinuity argument. But of course television is shaped by commercial pressures, but so are the movies. And before the movies, so were the novel, and so was the theater. And I'll come to my conclusion now. Some of you have heard this before. We alluded to it earlier, but I'll make it explicit. It is instructive in this regard to compare prevailing attitudes toward television with the attitudes that were held a generation ago toward our homegrown movies and movie makers. Many film scholars have pointed to the irony, and this is the irony we began our class with, that America's recognition of her own achievement in the art of film lagged far behind that of Europe. Our genre movies came finally to seem valuable to us, the film critics have shown, only after the French Nouvelle Vague directors had popularized for educated Americans the myths and conventions of those great ancestors of today's police and detective series, the films of Bogart and Cagney and Edward G. Robinson. And there was a time, it was in my lifetime, not that long ago, therefore, although it may seem like ancient history to you, when movies were regarded with the same contempt that television was held in until the day before yesterday. This change in American attitudes toward the movies, or more accurately, this change in the attitudes of our educated classes, because the masses have loved their movies and their television, right, is the more instructive and grows more ironic when we consider how its emergence is tied to the decline of the movies as a form of popular art. Through the 50s and the 60s, as the critics of American film lost their defensiveness and began to speak with the same confidence as the literary critics, the American film itself was being supplanted by television. This is going to be one of the key aspects of our course, and we're going to look at this fact closely and complexly, I hope, was being supplanted by television as America's principal medium of popular narrative. In 1951, in the early dawn of the television age, 90 million Americans, I got this number wrong in a previous class, 90 million Americans attended the movies every week. Think of that. By 1959, weekly attendance had fallen to about 43 million. And today, the vast majority of Americans, except for teenagers and other weirdo subcultures, attend the movies only 2 or 3 times a year. As the Hollywood studios and their machinery for star making and film manufacturing receded into history, and as there emerged a generation of reviewers and critics and finally even university professors whose deepest experience of art had occurred in the movie houses of their childhood, The American film itself came to be detached or liberated from its identity as a consumer item, a mere commercial product, and to be located within an aesthetic field. It was understood as a narrative, as a form of story, as something worthy of attention in that way. This recognition of the aesthetic nature of American film was a great achievement in a way, because it caused us to rethink what the movies were, and also caused us to rethink some of the implications of what our economic system is capable of producing, because it was a form of mass manufacture. It was a machine for story making. But this recognition of the aesthetic dimension of American movies was in certain respects a belated one, and this is the irony we began with, isn't it? By the time it had been fully established in our educated consciousness, in our museums, our universities, the American film itself was no longer an habitual experience for the majority of our population, having yielded to television not only its ability to incite our contempt for manufactured entertainment, but also its status as our central institution for storytelling. I'll see you next week.